Herr Kreisky.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another discussion out of Kreisky's Wohnzimmer, this time in our series of Transatlantica, dealing with transatlantic relations. And as you are all aware of, transatlantic relations in the last 4 years have been a rather roller coaster ride. We have confronted with an American administration who was not only rather negligent about European concern, but in fact contemptuous and hostile. And for the first time in, as far as everybody can remember, an American president has said that European integration is a mistake and that Europe is not a partner, but in fact an enemy. So this was sort of, you could hear the shock waves throughout Europe. And now we are confronted with another administration. We are dealing with a new administration that has changed the tone considerably. President Biden, in one of his first public statements, has issued the famous words, "America is back, diplomacy is back." The question is for us, is this a basis on which we can build a new and strong transatlantic relationship equipped to deal with the problems, the international problems that are definitely there? Raimund, who does not have to be introduced to our audience, and I will have the pleasure of discussing these issues with an American friend, Charles Kupchan, who has been at the Kreisky Forum once before, knows us well, and is professor at Georgetown University and also senior fellow at the American Council on Foreign Relations, has published numerous books, articles, is a well-known commentator on international affairs. And we are very much looking forward to discussing these issues with Charles. Charles, welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you again to the Kreisky Forum, once again to the Kreisky Forum, virtually and in distance this time, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we will have the pleasure of welcoming you again in Vienna physically. I would like to invite you to begin our discussion perhaps with a brief statement, your impressions on and your reading of what the foreign policy of the Biden administration is going to focus on. And also perhaps we have all read and seen your recent book about isolationism and this strain in American history that is always there in discussion, isolating America from the rest of the world. Is that feasible and is that an option? The floor is yours, and we are all looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to join you and RAIMUND, and I look forward to our conversation. My only regret, as you already stated, is that we are doing this several thousand miles apart, but the vaccines are starting to roll out, so hopefully we can gather in person before too long. Let me begin by suggesting that we are at the beginning of a third era in American foreign policy, American engagement with the rest of the world. The first era ran from the beginning of America's life as a federation in 1789 until Pearl Harbor in 1941. And broadly speaking, I think this was the era of isolationism, in which the United States steered clear of the rest of the world, defined American exceptionalism as an experiment in political and economic liberty that required staying away from the outside world because it would compromise American liberty. It would compromise American prosperity. And so the US focused on westward expansion, on pushing France and Britain and Spain and Russia out of the Western Hemisphere, but really did not go further and defined itself in terms of separation, geopolitical detachment, strategic autonomy, unilateralism, and isolationism. The second era began, as I said, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, in which the United States swung to the opposite extreme. And American exceptionalism was not about protecting the experiment from within, but exporting that experiment, taking manifest destiny abroad. And really beginning with World War II, the United States has had hundreds of bases around the world. It has had troops in all quarters of the globe. It has used trade as a way of expanding its reach to partners in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere. I think in many respects, that second era, the era of what I would call liberal internationalism, came to an end with Trump's election. In his inaugural address, Trump said, from this day forward, it's America first, only America first. And he was reaching back to the America First Committee that opened in 1940 to convince President Roosevelt not to attach the United States to the wars that were taking place in Europe and Asia. It was a committee for isolationism, if you will. And Trump, in many respects, was not so much a bolt from the blue, something that came out of nowhere. He was reaching back to an earlier tradition in American statecraft, the earliest tradition, if you will, the isolationism, the unilateralism, the protectionism, the nativism. These were all characteristics of American engagement in the world from 1789 to 1941. And Trump was in many respects reacting to his assessment, and I think it was a correct assessment, that for many Americans, there was too much world and not enough America. Too many wars, too much free trade, too many alliances, too many immigrants. And Trump basically said, hey, hold on. Let's pull back. Let's focus on our problems. Let's build schools in Arkansas, not in Afghanistan. And I think one of the reasons that Trump was elected, one of the reasons that Trump was almost reelected, 74 million votes, was that he was correctly assessing this view among Americans that it was time to focus more on the home front. Now, that having been said, I think Trump dramatically overcorrected. Rather than easing off, rather than trying to rebuild a more modest brand of internationalism that was in keeping with public sentiment, Trump took a wrecking ball to the world that America made. He alienated allies. He tried to build a wall on the border with Mexico. He picked trade fights with everybody. And in many respects, this hurt him. Many Americans said he doesn't know what he's doing. And it did lead to a swing in the political pendulum back to the center and back to the Democrats. Hence, we see Joe Biden's victory in the November election. Now, where is Biden? I think in many respects, Biden's key task is to correct for Trump's overcorrection. There's no going back to the liberal internationalism of the late 19th and the late 20th and early 21st century. There is, I think, a sense that the United States does need to focus more on the home front. So in many respects, I think Biden's key challenge here is to find that middle ground, to find a way of stepping back and rebuilding the United States at the same time that it focuses on key challenges abroad. So let me end with just a few key reflections on how I think Biden's foreign policy is likely to unfold. In two key respects, I think Biden will break fundamentally and has already broken fundamentally with Trump. One is bringing America back to teamwork, to international cooperation, whether it is through NATO, allies in Asia, the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, the Iran nuclear deal. The United States is indeed back as a builder of joint action, as a multilateralist country. And secondly, Biden is rebuilding America's commitment to democracy, to the rule of law, to political civility, to pluralism, to tolerance. I have to say, as an American who lived in Washington for the last 4 years, my country was unrecognizable. Trump was taking it in directions that were shocking. And Biden, when he said as a candidate, this is an election for the soul of America, he meant it. And he is trying to restore the soul of America by standing by the rule of law, by standing by social and racial justice. So in those two key areas, multilateralism and the reaffirmation of America's commitment to Republican values, I think Biden is making critical corrections to Trump's mistakes. The three issues where I think we should keep an eye on and where perhaps we can engage in our conversation would be the following. Biden will be a domestic president. It won't be America first, but he has to put Americans first, because one of the takeaways from the Trump era is that many Americans are unhappy. They are having a hard time making ends meet, putting food on the table, taking care of their families. And that's why Biden has said, we will have a foreign policy for the middle class. We will focus on pandemic recovery, on infrastructure, on healthcare, on childcare, on new jobs, on green technology. These are critical efforts to repair the American experiment and to rebuild the foundations for American engagement abroad. Secondly, I think that it's quite clear that Biden intends to continue Trump's effort to pull back, to engage in retrenchment, not isolationism, but trying to find the sweet spot, trying to step back without stepping away. He's announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's announced combat troops will be leaving Iraq. He is shrinking the American footprint abroad because Americans have tired of the forever wars. But he is definitely standing by the U.S. commitment in Europe and the U.S. commitment in Asia. He is trying to form an alliance of democratic states to deal with Russia and China and other threats to the geopolitical landscape. My final point, I think Biden is struggling to find the right balance between what I would call a more ideological foreign policy, a world in which the democracies array themselves against autocracies, and a more pragmatic foreign policy, where the U.S. and its allies stand up to Russian meddling, they stand up to Chinese efforts to manipulate politics, to push out, to violate the human rights of citizens. But at the same time, we try to work with Russia, China, and other non-democracies to meet the global challenges of the day, whether it's climate change, cybersecurity, nuclear proliferation, North Korea, Iran. We together face many challenges that cannot be dealt with except through cooperation between democracies and non-democracies. And so I see Biden as trying to figure out how to build a world in which the democracies rejuvenate and come together, in which they stand up to violations of human rights, Russian and Chinese efforts to undermine liberal democracy, but at the same time reach across ideological dividing lines. We'll have to see how this contradiction, this tension plays out. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this very interesting analysis and deep analysis, really, of what is going on. I would, from our perspective here, I would say that we are now in the 4th month of the Biden administration, yeah? And although the slogan leading up to the election was Sleepy Joe, sort of as a trademark that Trump always used in the discussion, there was such a flurry of activity and such a flurry of initiatives in those 4 months, which was unheard of. And also the amount of money that is going to go into this reconstruction effort of the American economy, of the social system, of the American infrastructure is of a proportion that is unheard of, that in a way compares to Roosevelt's New Deal and so on. So I understand your argument that to a large extent this administration will be inward-looking and will take the responsibilities that are there very seriously, especially also in the social issue, in the infrastructure issues. On the other side, and here I come to the European perspective, if this is true, no American government can stay away from foreign policy. Yeah? I mean, it's the sheer weight of the United States necessitates that America is involved also with the world. This is like a giant. If a giant is sitting quietly in a room, he is nevertheless a giant. Yeah, and it will not be possible to stay out, but it will be more important, perhaps, to go and look for cooperation and for working closely with allies and doing things also perhaps with a burden sharing and with different role models and role distribution and so forth. So I think that especially in this regard, the importance of the transatlantic relationship is going to grow in the foreseeable future, especially also in those issues that you have mentioned when we talk about strengthening democracy in light of authoritarian attacks here and there, dealing with Russia, dealing with China, an extremely important issue, and also looking at the inheritance of the problems in the Middle East. Hmm?
No, I agree with you in that there isn't an either or. And Biden himself has said this, right? He says there's no bright line anymore between domestic and foreign policy. And I think one of the issues that he's focusing on is to try to rebuild domestic consensus behind engagement abroad, precisely because he understands, as you laid out, that the United States has important business abroad with Europeans and elsewhere that it needs to attend to. I think that you're right to say that we haven't seen anything quite like this domestically since the New Deal. And I do see this as a New Deal. And I see Biden modeling himself on Roosevelt. In fact, he has put up a portrait of Roosevelt in the Oval Office because he sees the challenge as on par with the challenge that Roosevelt faced after the Great Depression during the 1930s. You know, a couple points I would focus on. Number one, there really is a sense of emergency here in the United States. I cannot overstate that. You know, to put it bluntly, we have gone through a near-death experience for American democracy. We just lived through a month in which the President of the United States refused to acknowledge the outcome of an election confirmed by all 50 states. And then we had a violent siege of the United States capital. And I think because of that, and because of the shock of those events, there really is a sense that we need to repair the country from the inside out. And that's why you're seeing huge sums of money being put forward to deal with the pandemic, with infrastructure, with healthcare, with many other issues. There really is, I think, a call to arms to rebuild the country, because American democracy is at stake. And if American democracy is at stake, so too is democracy everywhere else. And we've seen, as you both well know, the emergence of right-wing populism in many democratic countries in Europe. The second point I'd make is that I do think that you're right to say that Biden is going to be an Atlanticist. He has it in his DNA, in his bloodstream. He believes strongly that the United States and Europe are the anchor of the liberal international system, and I agree with that assessment. But I think he will also look to Europeans to do more. He will look to Europeans to pick up some of the slack that is left behind as the United States reduces its engagement in the Middle East. And I would encourage Europeans to think about where they can step up, whether it is in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria, to help deal with the world in which the United States is going to put its domestic priorities first and may be somewhat less involved, particularly militarily, in Europe's near abroad, in Europe's periphery, if you will. But I do think that you're right to say that we are not witnessing a separation between Europe and the United States. On the contrary, I think there is a view that because of the dangers that we have lived through, the threats that we have seen to liberal democracy, the Biden administration is going to work extremely closely with its European allies, not just on the traditional transatlantic agenda, but on making sure that we address the future of work, that we address immigration, that we address inequality, that we address wages, because these core fundamental democratic domestic issues are key to the functioning of democracy.
Well, I think that for Europeans, the big surprise to see what Biden is doing is to realize that this guy who had the reputation to be a rather boring politician suddenly turned out to be a revolutionary. As far as social policy is concerned in the US, as far as investment plans are concerned, the billions and billions that the American government is mobilizing in order to rebuild infrastructure, that's something I think that surprised Europeans, and hopefully in some governments there will be, the brain will start to tick, maybe we should do something on that dimension too, and these domestic policy initiatives to rebuild under new conditions the social safety net on the continental level. That is something that Europe still has to wait for and to realize that it might be necessary. I think where the Europeans don't exactly understand is what does that mean for the international stand of the United States and for the vision of the world we are in now from the point of view of Washington. We don't know, and that would be a question to you, in how far there might be a bipartisan foreign policy again in Washington, or might we have a situation where maybe a new Trump will come and everything will change again. Is this situation where the US does not act as a only superpower anymore, because that had been up to Trump, sort of the situation was the US are the only really acting superpower, and acted on the self-confidence of being the only guy who counts And that is changing, of course, independently of what the American foreign policy might have as far as priorities are concerned, because, as you mentioned, the international influence of the US is retreating. It's less than it was 10, 15 years ago, because other powers, China, but not only China, are acting more strongly, are on the level of world politics, have a bigger role to play. And it's always difficult for a superpower to realize it's not the only superpower anymore. There is a world where other powers claim with good reasons that they are superpowers too, and they should be taken into consideration. And here I think some of the signs from Washington are not clear. The hardline words towards Putin. Putin killer, where the president said yes when he was asked on television, which is not something that normally would happen on, between presidents. Also, the way China is considered not only as a competitor, but as an adversary, as an enemy, more or less. These are elements that I would say don't make it clear in which direction American foreign policy is really going.
Well, you raise two critical issues, Raimund. One is, where are we on the question of bipartisanship? And is there a prospect for the rebuilding, the reconstitution of a bipartisan center that would look more like the U.S. during the Cold War, or the U.S. before the George W. Bush and the Trump era, the Obama era? And the answer is, at least for now, the prospects are not good. Right? The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are far apart. Trump continues to exercise enormous influence over the Republican Party. And one of the key issues that we all need to keep our eye on is, how will Biden navigate a country and a Congress that remain deeply divided? Will he get rid of the filibuster? The filibuster is a procedure in the Senate that requires 60 votes, not just 50 votes or 51 votes to pass legislation. This is a huge issue that is under discussion now. And he may have to address this issue, because it's going to be very hard to get Republican support for much of what he wants to do. This is particularly an issue in a timely sense, in that the midterms are only about a year and a half away, and Biden clearly wants to make progress on the domestic economy, not just the pandemic, but on infrastructure, on jobs, on getting wages up, because it's important to making sure that he retains control of the House and the Senate after the midterms. The other issue that you raised is something that weighs heavily on my mind. I do worry that the Biden administration has come out a bit too hard on the whole question of a world that's organized along ideological lines. Biden has talked about wanting to organize an alliance of democracies to stand up to non-democracies. He talks about the 21st century being defined by a battle between the utility of democracy and autocracy. I think this is a troubling way to go in a world in which China is about to have the world's largest economy, in which China is building Belt and Road, in which China is the leading investor in Africa. The world is changing. The world is definitely changing. And we need to find a way to push back against China, to speak up against violations of human rights, to say that you cannot take Taiwan by force, and we will stand by that commitment. And I think we need to make a similar set of claims vis-a-vis Russia, whether the issue is Ukraine or Georgia or Navalny or interference in European and American elections, right? We need to stand up to those threats and those kinds of aggressive behavior. But at the same time, we do live in a much more complicated world, a more multipolar world. And as a consequence, we need to find ways to work across ideological dividing lines. Is Washington aware of that and ready to act accordingly? I don't know, to be quite blunt. I think that they're still feeling their way forward on this issue. I'm guessing that in some ways what we're going to see here is tension between an ideological orientation, which is about a world that is predicated upon democratic alliances and the liberal international system, and the reality of needing the help of non-democratic powers to deal with many issues, including climate change, including North Korea, including stability in the broader Middle East. And we'll have to just wait and see how ideology and the situation on the ground play out. But I do think that Europeans will have a real say in this issue, and especially when Biden tries to build a united front of European and Asian democracies to stand up to China. I think he will realize that in some respects, that will be an easy task. In other respects, it will be a very difficult task. And in that respect, it may require compromise and a foreign policy that is less ideological and more pragmatic.
Charles, speaking very personally here, I was a little bit surprised when Biden came out so strongly with this alliance of democracies idea. Because alliance of democracies was already established by the Secretary General of the United States, of the United Nations, and apart from a number of international conferences, there were no real results, no tangible results that came out of this alliance of democracies. On the other side, that does not take away from the importance of the issue. And it is, of course, an issue that is very close to home in Europe as well. Yeah, I mean, we have European countries, we have European Union members who are not only flirting with the idea of illiberal democracy and authoritarian rule, but are actually doing it. And we see the problems in Hungary, we see it in Turkey, we see it in Poland. I mean, this whole question is very close to home already in Europe. And so I'm convinced that if there is sort of reaching out from the American administration in this context, they will find a very positive and a very open response in Europe, because we are very conscious of this threat. On the other side, as far as the relations to China are concerned, the signals are a little bit mixed. A few days ago, we have been informed that there will be a bilateral American-Chinese working group on climate issues, yeah? Which is an excellent sign, and I think, I mean, it would really be progress that these two major countries of major importance when it comes to climate issues are finding a way to cooperate with each other. Yeah, we have now just hosted in Vienna the talks on a possible revival of the Iran treaty. Yeah, where Austria as a country was not directly involved, but at least we were hosting the meetings here, and that also is very positive signs in a way. And we have also seen statements about the revival of some of the disarmament agreements with Russia, which would also be a process, in my opinion, a step in a very positive direction.
Well, you know, just listening to our conversation, I have a feeling that the three of us have a similar view on this issue, in the sense that we understand the challenges that democracies face. Many of them are internal, they are not external. One of the reasons that Russia has been so successful in interfering in politics in the United States and in countries in Europe is because the politics are divided to begin with, and they are amplifying division, they're not causing division. And so I agree with you, Eva, that we need to figure out how to make our liberal democracies function effectively again, how to deal with Hungary and Poland and Turkey, where we have seen a liberal democracy take root in a way that's very worrying. But I see most of the agenda that we need to address together as about us. It is about the future of work. It is about immigration. It is about wages. It is about how to build societies that feel that the social contract is working, right? Because our societies have gone through profound changes as a consequence of globalization and automation and the advent of social media. We need to figure out the implications of those developments for our societies. But I agree with you that we should not view the challenges to democracy, the need to renew the functioning of liberal democracy, as a call to arms against Russia and China and others. We need to find a way of dealing with the threats that they pose while also working with them. As I think I mentioned, I see the world as going through a profound change. It is going to be multipolar. It is going to be ideologically diverse in ways that we really haven't seen since World War II. You know, the Soviet Union at its height was only 60% of American GDP. China is about to have an aggregate wealth larger than that of the United States. There's no going back to a two-block world. There's no going back to a world in which the democracies uncouple or decouple themselves from China or from the Asian economy. So we really do have to figure out how to manage a globalized world that is no longer run from Washington or Brussels or Moscow or Beijing. It's not going to be run from any particular place. And that magnifies the importance of coming together and figuring out a broader multilateral approach to global governance.
I think this ambiguity that consists in the fact that the administration, but democratic countries are very tough as far as human rights is concerned. In the case of Russia, the situation of Navalny symbolizes that the question of human rights. And at the same time, the new administration is ready to talk to the Russia administration, to Putin, about nuclear disarmament. And these are two different levels. One is the level of relations between states and governments, and the other is more or less the level of ideological discussion. But still, I think the destabilizing effect of Russian influence in Europe has to do with geopolitical insecurity that came up after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine came up. All these former Soviet republics became independent states, and it was not clear what does that mean geopolitically. We know that the West at the time, Baker, Genscher and others promised to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east. Reality was different. It did expand to the east. And that is, I think this geopolitical gray zone of who really has the last word geopolitically in this area between Moscow and Brussels. Where does Ukraine belong to? Ukraine itself is discussing, has a lot of internal division. So I wonder if we want to come to a situation where in Europe we need a reasonable, fair relationship with Russia. We need a situation where the borders that exist are accepted by Russia, by the West, by everybody. I would think we need to resolve these open questions that had been open after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. We need something like a new Helsinki agreement where everybody sits maybe in a long process together and says, okay, we may have differences, but let's try and sort it out. And at the end, we come to a result where geopolitically we don't dispute anymore whose area of influence is Ukraine, whose areas of influence is the Baltics, whose area of influence is the Caucasus. And that is something, it's a broad view, this is a long-term perspective, but I think if we want to stabilize the relationship with Russia, it will be very difficult to avoid to confront these kind of questions. It will not be enough to discuss about democracy, about human rights. We'll also have to discuss about the geopolitical role of Russia in the framework of the neighborhood in Europe.
I basically agree with your assessment. I'm someone who has not been a big fan of the enlargement of NATO, going back to the 1990s when the process began. It is now a fait accompli. It has happened. We can have a debate, a reasoned debate about whether it worked well or didn't work well, but it has led to a situation in which the Russians feel aggrieved and in which they feel that NATO has encroached into their traditional sphere of influence. Now, what do we do about that now? I'm not sure that there is a solution that is crystal clear. I'm guessing that the way forward will be to muddle through. I think effectively speaking, NATO is not going to go to Belarus or Georgia or Ukraine or other countries that are of concern to Russia
But why does NATO not promise Russia exactly that? Maybe in the framework of a situation similar to the situation of Austria at 55 neutrality. Yeah? I mean, that is something that the Ukrainian leadership doesn't want to hear. But if the West would tell the Russians, okay, if we have a system where we can guarantee the borders, we accept neutrality in this territory of the former Soviet Union, that may, I think, change a lot also inside the Kremlin.
I would ask you whether you think you can get a consensus for that kind of clarity within NATO. My guess is that in the alliance, the perm reps would look at their feet and say, well, that's sort of effectively what our policy is, but we don't want to come out and say that because it's difficult to do so for political reasons. But effectively, RAIMUND, I think that's where we are. I think it's very unlikely that you will see NATO go further. But in broad brushstrokes, I agree with you that there should be a conversation about a broader European security architecture in which Russia is a participant rather than a kind of target, which is what's ended up with NATO. One other point I want to make here, because I think it's important that we raise it. I think that we in Europe and the United States have made a mistake by pushing Russia toward China. The relationship between Russia and China has historically been difficult more conflictual than cooperative. But today we see a marriage of convenience between Russia and China because they collectively believe that they need to stand up to the West's encroaching ambition. I would like to see the US and its European partners engage in a conversation about how to lure Russia to the West, in part as a way of distancing Moscow from Beijing. Because, I mean, the last few minutes we've been talking primarily about Russia, but the big elephant in the room is China. It's China that's changing the world. It's China that has the resources to reach out to Latin America, to Africa, to Europe. And so in that respect, I think we need a more sophisticated, a more nuanced strategy with the Russians to the rise of China on the global stage.
I fully agree with that, and I think what we have to be aware of, that speaking again from a European experience, a European perspective, the relationship to Russia has been mishandled, basically since 1989 onwards. And it will take a lot of effort and a lot of very confidence-building steps to put that into a balance again. Russia has been humiliated, Russia has been pushed away, Russia has been badly treated and so forth. And they feel that. It's a very proud nation with a long history and a long also political diplomatic tradition, and they take that very seriously. And I think part of this messy situation that we are in at the moment goes back to sort of psychological issues, of being badly treated, being humiliated, and so forth, and goes in a way beyond realpolitik. But that brings me to another issue that I wanted to raise, and we have focused now very strongly on President Biden and so on, but there is a whole administration around. And I think what is very encouraging is the manpower that President Biden has been brought back into the administration. People with a lot of experience, people with know-how, and who know how to handle these affairs, who know the history of conflicts and so on, and who now are back in a position of influence. And I think that is in itself a very encouraging sign, as well as the sheer fact that the most of these nominations have gone very smoothly in Congress. There has been not that I'm aware of, sort of rejection of appointees of the president. I mean, we see Mr. Blinken in Foreign Affairs, experienced, long European relationship, very well connected here, and so on. We see other people, Jake Sullivan, who was directly involved in the Iran negotiations, now back in the National Security Council. Things are very encouraging in that respect. And I think what we will see in the near future is exactly that kind of, as we have seen with the China working group on climate issues, that you have small steps, but significant steps that are going to rebuild confidence. Don't you think so?
I would agree with that assessment. I mean, the people who are populating the Biden administration are, for the most part, seasoned professionals. They are internationalists. They are multilateralists. They understand that there are new issues that need to be addressed, whether it's digital governance or the climate issues the domestic agenda as a key stepping stone to a more internationalist foreign policy. So yes, there's no question that we've gone from an administration in which there were few experts and no policy process to speak of, to an administration staffed by seasoned professionals and the restoration of a serious foreign policy process. But I don't want to underestimate the challenges. I don't want to underestimate the degree to which the United States remains a troubled place, right? It was a very close election. Political passions continue to run high. Getting bipartisan support for important legislation will be difficult. Democrats and Republicans generally don't talk to each other. So yes, we have seen a very positive, welcome change politically, but we're not out of the woods yet. There is a lot of hard work to do. And I do think, as we've been discussing over the course of today, that there are tough questions ahead about ideology versus pragmatism, about the degree to which the United States can rebuild democratic solidarity, but at the same time reach across ideological dividing lines to work with Russia and China as needed. But I do think that when it comes to Europe, we're back in a situation in which we are in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. And to me, that is extremely welcome news, because my view of history is that Europe and the United States, Europe and North America have together helped the world move in a more prosperous, more stable, more free, more liberal direction over the course of the last 100 years or so. And I'm hoping that the rebirth of that relationship, along with the help of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and other Asian democracies, will continue that process. But as I've said, this cannot be at the exclusion of Russia and China and other countries that may not yet be democracies. We have to figure out a way to deal with a multipolar world at a time when the demands of global governance are unprecedented.
Yeah, do we have time for one more issue?
Yes,
okay,
sure.
Then I would very much like to raise one more point: the Iran negotiations that are taking place in Vienna now, with the administration has signaled that they want to come back to the Iran nuclear deal, but the way how that would operate seems to be very unclear. There is not even direct negotiations between the Iranians and the Americans, but the Europeans cross the Ringstraße between one hotel where the Iranians are seated to the other where the American delegation is. But still, I mean, the fact that the administration says, yes, we want to go back to that agreement is implicitly a signal we were wrong to leave. The US was wrong to leave. And these sanctions that were consequences of the Trump administration to leave that agreement should not have a basis to exist anymore. I understand it's a very complicated situation. You have the Israelis trying to do everything to prevent an agreement to happen, included attacks that the in Tehran that the Iranians consider terrorist attacks. We have a very tense situation in the Iranian leadership, and we don't really know if these negotiations will lead anywhere. But I wonder why it does, with all the experience that Eva mentioned of the foreign policy team, why is it not possible for the administration to say, okay, yes, we relinquish these sanctions, we start from where we had been before we left, before Trump left the agreement, and we talk from there. At least on some levels, because the situation as it is now makes it very difficult for the people in Tehran who want an agreement to stay in the negotiation position. So is that politically not possible in Washington, just to say, okay, we give up, there are enough sanctions not linked to the nuclear deal that would still be in place. We give up the sanctions linked to the nuclear deal and a couple of other signals showing that the Americans changed, the administration changed its position to the Iranians.
Well, I think the Biden team has been explicit from the beginning that withdrawing from the deal was a mistake. And the president explicitly said, we would like to rejoin negotiations. And the deal that was struck because the Iranians were not prepared to sit down and talk face to face, perhaps because they've got elections upcoming, is the structure that you described, where you've got this shuttle going back and forth. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I think there are two issues that are key. One is the sequencing, and that is, should the United States, as the Iranians say, move first, because it was Trump, after all, who decided to pull out of the deal, or should there be some kind of joint decision to take steps together? That is to say that the sanctions come down at the same time that Iran goes back to the constraints that were part of the original deal. And I'm guessing that the discussion will lead to that sort of deal. That is to say, where both sides will act together rather than one side moving first. The Iranians have basically said, we will talk and we will move, but contingent upon the U.S. bringing down the sanctions. My best guess is that the sweet spot here is moving together. And then the second issue is, what do we do about other issues, sanctions that are not related to the nuclear deal, that have to do with ballistic missiles and that have to do with Iran's troubling behavior in the Yemen crisis, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. And there, I think what they'll try to do is to compartmentalize, to have a situation where the issue of the nuclear deal is addressed, the sanctions related to the nuclear deal come down in response to an Iranian agreement to put their nuclear program under wraps, and then we deal separately with the other issues. But yes, Raimund, you're right to say that this is a very difficult issue politically, and that even though this is not a deal that has to be ratified by the Senate, I think the president is looking carefully at what kind of ultimate agreement with the Iranians can enjoy domestic political support. We're at least we're in the game. At least the conversation is taking place. The other issue that we have to watch, and here we haven't seen any movement yet, is North Korea, where obviously we have a country that already has a nuclear weapons capability, and Biden has to figure out how to deal with that challenge.
I think we have come more or less to the end of our conversation. It was fascinating to talk to you, Charles. Thank you very much for your insights. And I hope we can do it again in the not too distant future.
It's been my pleasure to join both of you. Thank you very much for hosting the conversation. And let's all agree to do this again when we can do so in person, and follow it up with some good food and some good wine.
Absolutely. We will keep that in mind and we will work for it. Thank you very much, Charles.